We can say what we like about Admiral Ajuin's fighting ability, but he was right about one thing when he said that with the fall of Bougainville, Japan would also fall. The air raid on Rabaul on November 2nd did not inflict heavy casualties, but the raid 3 days later was a disaster. The Americans regarded our raid on Pearl Harbor as a disaster, but their raid on Rabaul was even worse. An entire squadron of cruisers, which they had tried with fanatical persistence to preserve by keeping out of action for a whole year, was put out of action in one day. How could this have happened? The Rabaul disaster of November 5th was a direct consequence of the sad outcome of the battle at Empress Augusta Bay. The lessons of the battle were completely ignored, the mistakes were repeated, growing, becoming fatal. Admiral Amori's confidence that he had definitely sunk one American cruiser and damaged two led not only to his promotion to vice admiral, but also to the dispatch, by order of Admiral Koga himself, of 7 more cruisers to Rabaul. Admiral Koga and all the officers on his staff had already forgotten the last time they had fought a battle against a daily gaining enemy. Vice Admiral Kurita, who had succeeded Admiral Kondo as commander of the Second Fleet, shared Admiral Koga's self-confidence and optimism. His self-confidence had been fueled by the last air raid on Rabaul, when the Americans had failed to get a single direct hit on the warships. Kurita himself had not been in combat for more than a year, still believing that the Japanese fighters have a qualitative advantage over the Americans and on material and on the skill of pilots, as it was in 1942. At dawn on November 5th, Kurita's compound arrived at Stimpson's Rabaul Bay. I watched in amazement as Kurita's flagship cruiser, Atago, rattled her anchor chain with majestic nonchalance in a narrow bay already clogged with 7 cruisers and 40 auxiliary vessels supporting them. The sight of this picture made my heart feel somehow uneasy. At 7, the same-day patrol plane reported the detection of 5 heavy cruisers, 7 destroyers and 2 enemy transports at a point 150 miles away on bearing 140 from Cape St. George. Headquarters decided that the Americans were again aiming to land somewhere. It never occurred to anyone that the detected transports were actually the aircraft carriers Saratoga and Princeton. The blatant illiteracy of our reconnaissance plane pilots had brought us to the brink of disaster many times before. Now it has. At 09:00 hours, the air raid sirens wailed in Rabaul. My Sigger, being on full alert, immediately gave the go-ahead, heading to leave the harbour past the heavy ships anchored. The cruisers, too, began to disengage from anchor when at 9:15 the aircraft of the American carrier group descended on the base. For 23 American Avenger torpedo bombers and 22 Dauntless dive bombers, covered by 42 Hellcat fighters, the 50 Japanese ships, huddled in the narrow bay at anchor, made excellent targets, like sitting ducks for hunters. About 70 of our Zero fighters were in the air, but they could not stop the fiery downpour of American bombs. Coming out of the harbour, the Sigger opened a hurricane anti-aircraft fire from all guns. I myself saw 2 planes shot down by the fire of our destroyer, and signalmen assured that we hit 2 more. The disaster might have been averted if the whole fleet had come out of the bay, as the Sigger had done. I was alone, as the previous day my other 2 destroyers had gone to Truk for repairs. Around 10 we returned to the harbour, and I was shocked at what had happened here in less than an hour. The flagship heavy cruiser Atago was on fire. The Maya and Takao were also burning. Their tubes and superstructures were badly damaged. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Chikuma, the light cruisers Agano and Noshiro, and the destroyers Fujinami and Amagiri were also badly damaged. I rubbed my eyes, unable to believe the reality of what I was seeing. At base headquarters, the usually intelligent Admiral Kusaka was spewing terrible curses in a rage. Meanwhile, all the Japanese airfields in the Rabaul area were buzzing like nests of disturbed bumblebees. All available machines were up in the air to retaliate against the Americans. About 100 bombers and fighters found the retreating enemy carrier group 235 miles southeast of Rabaul. Attacking the enemy, they reported sinking one large aircraft carrier and two cruisers and damaging one smaller aircraft carrier. This report could be called a total exaggeration. Admiral Kusaka, who was destined to survive the war, later recalled, "I was very skeptical of this report, as well as many other reports in the same spirit, which came to me at that time. I knew how much the combat skill of our pilots had fallen over the past year, but I could not reject these reports or demand that they be checked or rechecked, so as not to finally destroy the morale of those who made any sacrifices for the sake of victory over the enemy." The next day, November 6th, the cruisers Atago, Takayo, and Mogami waddled from Rabaul back to Truk under escort by the undamaged cruiser Suzuya and the not-so-damaged Takuma. I was heartbroken at the departure of these wrecked ships, remembering what hopes were pinned on them in pre-war times and how unjustified these hopes turned out to be. In Rabaul remained only the heavy cruiser Maya, which was so badly damaged that it could not go to sea, and the light cruiser Agano, which could hardly stay afloat at all. At noon of the same day I was summoned to Admiral Samejima's headquarters. The Admiral was gloomy. "I wish," he ordered, "to assign you one task tonight. In addition to Shiga, with you will go Yubari, the only remaining in-formation cruiser. The situation is very bad. We may be forced to surrender Bougainville, but we need to keep the nearest base in Buka. Therefore, it is necessary to strengthen the defences there." Such a decision did not surprise me. I saluted and turned to go, but the Admiral brought me back. "I'll be honest with you, Hara," he said, sighing. "I'd hate to send you on this trip, but this will be your last task. I remember well how much your destroyer needs overhaul and you need rest." Of all the Solomon Islands, Buka was closest to Rabaul. Siga and Yubari approached its coast deep at night, landing 700 soldiers of the 17th Army Division and unloaded 20 tons of supplies. Although the operation was short, the tension on both ships was very high. We met no opposition, but returned to Rabaul completely exhausted. I reported to headquarters to report on the completion of the mission and to say goodbye to Admiral Samejima. The task was surprisingly easy. I reported, but I warn next time it will not be so easy. So do not repeat what we did. It could end very badly. Admiral thanked me for the warning, said that he would miss me very much, especially with such an acute shortage of experienced officers. He expressed the hope that I would return back to Rabaul. On November 7th, at 0530 hours, the Siga left Rabaul. On the way home, we were to escort the two transports Tokyo Maru and on Takazan Maru to Truk. The volcanic hills of Rabaul were melting behind us in a foggy haze. How many had to live here? How many friends to lose in the ceaseless battles for the retention of the Solomon Islands? And all in vain. We were losing island after island, and by now only Buka was left in our hands, which could also fall at any moment. And then it would be Rabaul's turn. It was a clear and sunny day. The sea was calm. Everything was going smoothly and pleasantly, like a tourist cruise. Putting my face to the refreshing breeze, I stood on the bridge looking at the transports. We were travelling at 12 knots. By sunset, we were off the southwest coast of New Ireland. The weather continued to be calm and clear, with myriads of stars twinkling in the sky. We had passed Isabella Strait and were turning east toward Kavieng when the radio room reported that an encrypted radiogram had been intercepted saying that enemy planes were somewhere nearby. The pleasant tourist cruise was over. Increasing speed to 18 knots, I ordered a smoke screen to be put up. The transports, smoking desperately, developed their maximum running speed of 16 knots. I walked beside them to envelop them in the smoke of the veil. The planes appeared suddenly coming in from starboard. Fortunately, they chose a destroyer over the transports. As they passed over us, they turned around and began to come in on the Segura on the port side. From the way they steamed over the water, I realized they were the famous topmast masters. I had often puzzled over the method of evading their attacks, And now, as the two roaring monsters came straight at me, instinct told me the right thing to do. I opened a hurricane fire from all guns and machine guns and steered the Sigga on a straight course straight at the enemy. The bombs sliding on the water had little chance to hit me in the bow jumping out of the water. They exploded 10 meters from the starboard and port sides. Sigga was shaken and tossed about, but that was the end of it. The planes disappeared, and soon we intercepted on the radio talks of American pilots with the base in open text. The pilots reported that they had received heavy damage from anti-aircraft fire and were going to make an emergency landing on the water, asking to send a rescue seaplane. Soon we came to Cavien, unloaded there, and at dawn on November 8th we reached Truk. Again all was calm and pleasant, as on an entertaining cruise until 10 a.m., when I was informed that our sonar was out of order. The acousticians fiddled with it all day but couldn't fix it properly. The equipment was too old and worn out. It was very unpleasant. The area swarmed with American submarines, and Def Destroyer was difficult to protect the transports in a 3-day campaign. I ordered to prepare depth bombs, and the two transports were given a signal to increase the distance from each other to 1,500 meters. Sigga took up position on their starboard side. The holiday cruise was turning into a tense and nervous campaign. Nothing happened during the remaining hours of the day and night. The next day, Tuesday, was also quiet. On Wednesday, I conducted intense anti-submarine drills all morning. At 11:30, a stand-down was played to allow some rest for the crew. By this time, the weather had deteriorated somewhat. The sky was covered with clouds and the sea was agitated. Just at that moment, when the sailors were going on deck after lights out, I saw an ominous torpedo trail coming across the course of Segura from the starboard side. Unable to do anything, I watched silently as the torpedo headed in the direction of the Tokyo Maru, which was at that moment about 700 meters to the destroyer's port side. I followed the ominous trail in a daze. The torpedo had hit right in the middle of the transport. The force of the explosion that shook the destroyer brought me out of my stupor. Ordered to increase speed to 24 knots and prepare to drop depth bombs, I led Sigga along the torpedo trail, trying to calculate the location of the boat. We dropped 6 depth bombs, but no result was observed. The submarine was gone, and not surprisingly, given my delayed reaction to what had happened. I stood pale and angry, watching the Tokyo Maru. There was no fire or smoke visible on the transport, but it appeared that its engine room was flooded. There was no propulsion, but the ship was still afloat. Ontakesan Maru took the damaged transport in tow, and we proceeded onward at a speed of 7 knots. As we continued on our way, the roll of the Tokyo Maru gradually increased. After 8 hours, it became clear that the transport was doomed. Shiga came aboard, removing 70 crewmen from the transport, after which the Tokyo Maru sank rapidly. This was the first time I had ever lost a transport under my escort. Sigga and the transport Ontakesan Maru arrived at Truk about noon on November 11th. I went to the flagship cruiser Atago to report the sad results of our campaign to Admiral Kurita, commander of the Second Fleet. I was able to meet with the Chief of Fleet Staff, Rear Admiral Koyanagi. He was happy to see me, but when I tried to report to him about the campaign, he nodded his head, but it was clear that he was not listening to me, thinking about something else. Not understanding what the matter was, I fell silent. The Admiral perked up. "Excuse me, Hara. The fact is that the enemy has struck Rabaul again. This morning. Very heavy casualties." It turned out that 128 American planes lifted off from 3 aircraft carriers, the Essex, Banker Hill and Independence, appeared at 8:30 over Rabaul. Kusaka, having learned in time of their approach, ordered to raise in the air 68 Fighter Zero, which intercepted the enemy over Cape St. George. However, enemy bombers broke through to Rabaul and sank the destroyer Tsunami. The destroyer Naganami was severely damaged and the cruiser Agano was hit by a torpedo. Over 100 Japanese planes rushed in pursuit and reported damage to 2 aircraft carriers and a cruiser. That report, too, turned out to be pure illusion, but 41 planes were lost. "Excuse me, Hara," the Admiral continued, "I have to get back to the meeting." "Yes. Admiral Kurita wants you to escort the cruisers Miyako and Haguro, which leave for Sasebo tomorrow." "Good luck, Hara." And the Admiral almost ran down the corridor. Dejected at what I had heard, I returned to the Segura and ordered to prepare for the campaign for tomorrow. On November 12th at 0800 we left Truk escorting 2 heavy cruisers. Our departure coincided with Admiral Koga's decision to recall from Rabaul the aircraft from our 3 aircraft carriers, which had arrived there only 2 weeks earlier. Koga apparently parted with the idea of giving the Americans a decisive battle in the area of the Solomon Islands. The 5-day voyage went smoothly, and on November 17th, 1943, we anchored at Sasebo. This return was certainly more pleasant than in December 1942, when I returned with funerals for 42 sailors from my crew. In 8 months of service at Truk and Rabaul, the Sigga had not lost a single man. The sailors shouted with joy, jumped and hugged when the destroyer entered our home port. During the terrible battles near the Solomon Islands, we sometimes did not expect to see our native shores again. After 2 days of various bureaucratic delays and chatter, the Sigga was put into dry dock. The next day I couldn't fight off reporters and photojournalists from various newspapers who broke into the shipyard. They clicked camera shutters, scribbled pages of notebooks, asking the crew about the actions of the destroyer in distant southern waters. The fame of Sigga as the most famous destroyer of the Imperial Navy dates back to this time. Newspapers devoted entire pages to our ship, and someone even wrote a saga of Sigga. I was very uncomfortable to read some of the articles, full of fiction and strong exaggerations of the results that we managed to achieve in the battles. In the next few days, we organized a banquet for the crew of the Sigga at Mankiro's restaurant. The restaurant was very popular with the sailors. It was run by an elderly woman called Oseki-san. She treated every customer like a child, even calling admirals by their diminutive names. She was very simple in her treatment, recognizing almost no etiquette. She patted incoming officers on the back, saying their name loudly before the word hello. This is what she always did to me when I appeared at her establishment after a long absence. But this time I was taken aback. Dressed in a festive kimono, Oseki-san greeted me with a ceremonial bow and said in a tone I had never heard before, "Welcome home, Captain First Rank Hara. It is my greatest honor to host you and your illustrious crew. Please accept my deepest respects." "What's wrong, Oseki-san?" I was surprised. "What kind of strange things are you saying? Are you behaving so strangely? Are you well?" "It's me, Tamehara." "Are you kidding me? You've known me since I was a cadet." "I'm completely serious, Mr. Hara," she replied. "We're all so proud of you. I never thought you would become such a famous officer. I am so ashamed that I have been rude to you in the past." "What are you talking about, Oseki-san?" I laughed. "I'm the same Tamichi, the perpetual drunk who could almost never pay his bill in full. I guess I owe you something even now." "You're kidding me now," Tamichi-san, the hostess, said. "All debts, both yours and your crew's, have long since been cancelled, and tonight's banquet will be at the restaurant's expense. I've known many destroyers that were lost in battle, but your Sigga went through hell without losing a single man. I have been serving sailors for 50 years, and I have never met such an illustrious officer since Admiral Hayakiro Togo when he returned from his Tsushima triumph in 1905. "I see now," I said, "that you read the newspapers, Oseki-san. Don't believe anything it says about me and the Shiga. The fact that we saved the ships and survived ourselves, consider ourselves lucky. Perhaps because you prayed fervently for us to stay alive and repay your debts." We laughed together, but the hostess insisted that the whole banquet would be on the house. As we entered the hall, she whispered to me, "All the geishas in Sasebo have volunteered to serve your banquet for free. They also said they would not serve those Miauko and Haguro turkeys for any money." Needless to say how much fun we had. The next day, the entire crew of the destroyer was given leave home on a rotating basis for 10 days. I was very pleased to see the first batch of 80 sailors disembark from the destroyer, leaving for Sasebo Station. At Sasebo, I was able to meet Admiral Nagumo for the last time in my life, who had recovered from his illness and was awaiting a new assignment. Although the Admiral looked much better, there was a sense of doom in his every word. Perhaps he had foreseen both his own demise and that of the Imperial Navy. Nagumo died in July 1944 on the island of Saipan as commander of the entire Central Pacific region and the 14th Air Fleet. Soon I, too, exercised my 10-day leave entitlement by going home. Such a vacation I had never had before. Every day, or even several times a day, my officers and sailors came to see me, each time with a large bottle of sake. So I had nothing to do but sit with them for days and nights and drink. Of course, my wife and daughters were terribly displeased, but outwardly polite to the guests. On December 6th, I returned to Sasebo. My head was buzzing from endless drinking. It took a week for me to finally come to my senses. On December 20th, the repairs to the Sigga were completed. I conducted 2-day post-repair tests and made sure that the ship was brought to a state of full combat readiness and reported to headquarters, informing of the readiness to return to the South Pacific. I was ordered to stand by and wait. 3 days of languid waiting passed, after which I was summoned to the headquarters of the Sasebo Naval Base. There I was received by the Deputy Commander of the Naval Area, who personally handed me an order to be assigned as a teacher at the Mine Torpedo School. My bewilderment was quickly replaced by rage. Coast Guard. What was all that about? Admiral Semjima himself told me that he was waiting for my return to the theatre of operations, that he needed me. I want to go back to the front. I insist on it. Admiral patiently listened to my claims and said, "Calm down, Hara. Don't get excited. You don't know everything yet. Your appointment to the teaching job is not due to the fact that you were unable to serve on ships, as sometimes happens. You were selected for a special assignment on the recommendation of Admirals Nagumo, Ijuin and Omori. The assignment is top secret, and so far I can tell you that it involves an entirely new tactic for using torpedo weapons. It is generally agreed that no one but you is capable of accomplishing this work. It is one of the most important tasks facing our fleet at the present time." Back on the Segura, I gathered the crew on the half bay and said goodbye to all my sailors, wishing them success with their new commander. The shocked sailors were silent. Some had tears rolling down their cheeks. After gathering my things, I went down into the dinghy and took one last look at my proud ship. The crew, huddled around the windlasses and superstructures, waved goodbye to me with waving hands and caps. I tried to wave back, but my heart failed me. I sank down on the bank of the dinghy and cried. On January 10th, 1944, just as Admiral Koga ordered the transfer of combined fleet headquarters from Truk to Palau, I took up my duties as senior instructor at the mine and torpedo school in Sasebo. By this time, the school was mainly engaged in training the crews of torpedo boats, which had previously been neglected, but now, under an emergency wartime program, decided to build almost 500 units. The command was deeply impressed by the effectiveness of the American torpedo boats in the Solomon Islands. News from the front came with great delay, and I sometimes went to the base headquarters to familiarize myself with the latest secret reports. Of course, I was primarily interested in the fate of my former ships. The destroyer Amatsukaze escorted all of 1943 transports between Japan and the Southwest Pacific. Shortly after beginning my teaching career, I was shocked to learn that the Amatsukas had been torpedoed 250 miles north of Spratly Island. In the process, about 80 of its sailors were killed. The heavily damaged destroyer made it to Saigon and then moved to Singapore, where repairs continued until March 1945. Sigga was also used on escort duty after leaving Sasebo with a new commander. On February 17, 1944, she was hit by an aerial bomb. Damage was light, but 21 men were killed. The most shocking circumstance was the fact that this happened on Truk, which I used to think of as a quiet rear base. Then the disturbing news came in a waterfall. On March 30th, an American task force under Admiral Raymond Spruance struck the Caroline Islands, pulverizing the entire defense of Palau. Admiral Koga flew that same evening from Babel Thuep to move his headquarters to Davao in the Philippines and went missing. Upon learning of Toyoda's appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, I only shrugged my shoulders. From my point of view, he was completely unsuitable for the position. Until recently, he had commanded the naval base in Yokosuka, and before that he had been a member of the Supreme Military Council. He'd forgotten the last time he'd gone to sea. He'd certainly never been in combat. I still do not understand what the High Command was guided by when choosing the chief commanders. My skepticism about the abilities of Admiral Toyoda, unfortunately, soon confirmed. June 19th to 20th, 1944 aircraft carrier group Admiral Ozawa suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of the Mariana Islands, called the Americans' Grouse Hunt over the Marianas. Admirals, planning the operation, completely disregarded the increased skill of American pilots, new enemy radar, and low combat training of their own pilots. As a result, Ozawa lost 3 aircraft carriers and 500 aircraft. 4 months later, Ozawa flew off the Philippines with 3 aircraft carriers on a mission to bait the enemy, losing all 3 carriers and accomplishing nothing. On July 10th, I learned of the fall of the island of Saipan and the death of Admiral Nagumo on it. By this time I had been assigned to head the new torpedo school at Kawatana, near Sasebo. I had received a secret instruction to prepare the cadets for combat off the coast of Japan. I don't know what happened to me, but I suddenly sat down and began writing a message to Emperor Hirohito. It was stupid, of course, but apparently I could no longer control myself. I wrote that Japan had already lost the war, urging the emperor to take a realistic view of the situation. I pointed out that the highest positions in the army and navy were occupied by officers unfamiliar with the methods of modern warfare, and that the continuing rivalry between the army and navy made it impossible to conduct successful operations. I urged the emperor to end the war and, as a first step, to throw out of the service all incompetent admirals and generals. This action of mine reeked not only of gross indiscipline but of treason. I could well have been court-martialed in accordance with the naval regulations, but I didn't think about that at all. I thought only of the whole country heading for disaster. Having finished my petition, I took the first train to Tokyo. On July 12th, I entered the Navy Ministry building, terribly worried. The first person I saw there was Rear Admiral Prince Takamatsu, the Emperor's younger brother. I rushed over to him. "Your Highness, may I speak to you in private?" The prince's eyebrows rose at such insolence. He probably thought I was a little crazy, but he nodded and took me to his office. There I handed him my message, asking him to present it to the Emperor. "May I read it beforehand?" the prince asked. "Of course, Your Highness," I bowed. The prince slowly unfolded the paper and ran his eyes over the text. I could tell by the nervous movement of his eyebrows how unpleasant it was for him to read my message. He glanced at me again, apparently wondering if I was crazy or not, and then folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "All right," Hara said the prince, rising. "Don't worry about a thing." I never managed to find out what Prince Takamatsu did with my message to His Majesty. At any rate, it was never made known to anyone in naval circles. If the Minister of the Navy or the Chief of Naval Operations found out, I'd be in trouble. Meanwhile, the landing of the Americans on October 20th in Lake Gulf led to a series of naval battles in which our fleet was almost finished. On October 27th, an unprecedented communique was transmitted about the formation of the Kamikaze Corps voluntary suicide bombers. And then my old friend Captain First Rank Miyazaki showed up at the school. He brought new training methods for the cadets. They included the formation of the Shinho and Fukurui units. In fact, they were the naval counterparts of the Kamikaze Corps. Ocean sharks were drivers of wooden boats filled with explosives, on which they were supposed to crash into enemy ships. Underwater dragons were combat swimmers who, in lightweight diving gear, had to wait for the enemy to approach landing sites while in prearranged air bells and then explode under the bottom of enemy ships. In all battles, for me, the most important thing was to save people, and therefore I categorically refused to train the cadets on such methods. Miyazaki disagreed with me. I've thought long and hard about this, Hara, and I want to explain it to the cadets honestly. I will tell them how the sailors on my destroyer died despite their skill and years of combat experience. Now we're bleeding to death in the Philippines. Anyone who enters the battle will die. The enemy's advantage is such that simple methods can no longer stop him. Pilots volunteered to be kamikazes when they learned that 500 of their comrades with hundreds of hours of air combat experience were slapped like flies in the battle off the Mariana Islands. You know how our ships are dying one by one. Fighting Samudra was sunk by a submarine. You understand, a submarine sinks a destroyer. A mouse eats a cat. The Shiratsu collided with a tanker and sank with the whole crew. Your old Shiga, though, survived in late, becoming the only surviving ship of the entire Nishimura detachment, but its hour will soon come. Is this war? It's already a massacre. If we want to stop the Americans, we must deliberately go to our deaths, at the cost of every life, destroying hundreds of enemies. The next morning I called the entire school together and announced to the cadets the formation of the Marine suicide squads. I reminded them that they had entered the school to become members of torpedo boat crews. No one can force them to become suicide bombers. It was up to them to decide voluntarily without any pressure. I warned them that I would be in my office all night to take their applications. No one will ask questions about why you made your choice this way and not the other. There were 400 cadets in the school. They all went through my office before 4 o'clock in the morning, bringing a piece of paper with their name and choice. 200 decided to stay on torpedo boats, 150 volunteered to become boat suicide bombers, and 50 submarine dragons. Despite their formidable name, the ocean sharks proved to be a completely ineffective weapon. Even more useless were the underwater dragons. Such primitive methods were impossible to fight an enemy equipped with the latest science and technology for modern warfare. All of this just tore at my heart. I fell into a chronic depression, from which the only way out was to drink. I do not know how it would have ended for me if December 20th, 1944 was not ordered to surrender command of the school Miyazaki, and myself to take command of the light cruiser Yahagi. It was my happiest day in that terrible year. It is difficult for me to convey my jubilation when, on December 22nd, 1944, I walked up the gangway of the light cruiser Yahagi in Sasebo Harbor. I was returning to my native element with a chance to fight the enemy again, forgetting all the frustrations and intrigues of the shore service. The ship's senior officers gathered in the salon to introduce themselves to me. The chief mate, Captain Second Rank Shinichino Uchino, said in an excited voice, "The crew of the Yahagi is simply jubilant with happiness to have you as their new commander. Even the youngest recruits are talking about our miracle commander with pride." I replied that I was very grateful to my lucky fate to be given command of the Yahagi and added, "I have never commanded such a large ship before. I still have much to learn from each of you." My remark was received with polite silence. and I could sense that everyone was really perked up by my arrival aboard. If the mere fact of my arrival on the ship could lift the crew's spirits, that was great, as the crew of the Yahagi really needed it. The cruiser had just returned from a disastrous battle in Leyte Gulf, where she had been the flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's 2nd Fleet Support Group. The details of this battle were as yet unknown even to its participants. But many already knew that the Japanese fleet had been defeated and the United States had retaken the Philippine archipelago. When on October 25th, Admiral Kurita, having inflicted heavy damage to a group of enemy escort carriers, suddenly began his famous retreat, having failed to disrupt the American landing in Leyte Gulf, Yahagi with 3 destroyers were about 10 miles from the battle site. Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, commander of the 10th Destroyer Squadron, which included the Yahagi and 6 destroyers, was removed from his post after the battle. He was a fine sailor, but not a fighter. Kimura's unwillingness to fight was clearly demonstrated back in November 1942 at Guadalcanal, when his light cruiser Nagara, cunningly maneuvering, could not get close to the enemy, while the other ships were fighting the Americans at direct fire range. The use of Kimura afterward in a battle as important as Leyte illustrates perfectly, though it does not explain, the mysterious thought processes of our high command. But an even more serious error was the retention of Admirals Kurita and Ozawa in command positions. Both admirals survived the war and are still alive today. I would hate to criticize these unquestionably honest and courageous men, but I am convinced that the appointment of these 2 elderly and tired admirals to high command positions was a major factor in our disastrous defeat at Leyte Gulf. Kurita showed his blatant incompetence even when he took his 2nd Fleet to Rabaul to expose it there to American air attack. But despite this, he, like Ozawa, held on to his position. As a result, both admirals commanded our fleet forces in the battle off the Mariana Islands on June 19, 1944, once again demonstrating their mediocrity. But for reasons I still do not understand, both remained in their positions even after the defeat at the Marianas. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, also had a huge responsibility. Arriving in Japan from Formosa on October 18th, he commanded the battle first from Yokosuka, and then moved 30 miles off the coast to the resort of Haishi, from where he continued his duties as Commander-in-Chief. Thus, this fantastic operation was planned and managed from land by an admiral who had never participated in a single naval battle in his life. With the loss of Saipan Island, Japan had effectively already lost the war. After that, our battleships and heavy cruisers were simply thrown to the slaughter in Leyte Gulf. The day I arrived on the Yahagi, Kurita was finally removed from his post and replaced by Vice Admiral Saiichi Ito. Like many other decisions made at that time at the highest levels, this also stunned me. Ito had served continuously on the Naval General Staff since the start of the war, never having spent a single day at sea or had any combat experience. It seemed to me that everyone was crazy in the personnel office. Kurita, in spite of everything, was appointed head of the Naval Academy, and Ozawa was promoted to admiral and in May 1945 took the post of Commander-in-Chief of the United Fleet. In general, it is very telling that most of the senior officers who participated in the Battle of Leyte were promoted. Busy with my new duties on Yahagi, I watched with pain in my heart which of the destroyers of my old division survived in the Philippine meat grinder arrive at the base. Siga was part of Admiral Nishimura's formation when he, with 2 battleships, a cruiser and 4 destroyers, made his way to Leyte Gulf through Surigao Strait on October 25th. All ships except the Siga were sunk by the enemy. The surviving destroyer became the object of harsh criticism and ominous rumors, which I could not believe. I really wanted to personally talk to the crew of the destroyer and find out the truth. I waited a long time for the return of the destroyer until I received the news that the Siga had been torpedoed and sunk on January 24th by an enemy submarine north of Singapore. Just a shame that such a fine ship could fall victim to a submarine. A little later came the news that the Amatsukas would remain in Chinese waters and would also be unable to join the remnants of the Second Fleet. But not all the news was bad. Almost daily, new weapons and equipment arrived on the Yahagi. These included radio detonators, homing torpedoes, and, most importantly, effective radar stations. Commanders began training to fire radar-guided guns. Of course, many of the new techniques were still in the experimental stage, but their very appearance showed that Japanese science and technology had advanced far. And although everyone realized that it was too late, that in this respect we are still far from the enemy, samples of new weapons made a huge contribution to the morale of the personnel in these days of endless disasters. All our exercises, however, were confined to the cramped waters of the inland sea. When I asked why we were not allowed out on the high seas to conduct exercises under conditions closer to real combat conditions, I was told that our limited fuel supplies did not allow it. I knew we were perpetually short of fuel, but was shocked to learn that there was not enough fuel oil even to conduct a full cycle of exercises to increase crew combat training. On February 19, 1945, after a heavy preliminary bombardment, the Americans launched their invasion of the island of Iwo Jima. Not a single Japanese ship was sent to repel the enemy landing just 700 miles from the metropolis island. At the Emperor's headquarters, there was a furious debate for days about what to do with the remnants of the combined fleet. On March 1st, Admiral Ito reported to the headquarters that the exercises had been completed, and his force of 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 10 destroyers was ready for battle. But the High Command had not yet made a decision on whether to use the remnants of the fleet right now to contain the enemy offensive or to keep them for the defense of the islands of the metropolis from the upcoming invasion. While the heated debate continued in Tokyo, the Second Fleet moved to Kure, closer to the last fuel oil supplies. Fleet Command proposed to preserve the remnants of the naval force for the future. Army Command, on the contrary, citing the sad experience in Leyte Gulf, argued that it would be great folly to preserve the ships until they became easy prey for enemy aircraft. March 19th confirmed the fears of the Army Command. On that day, a powerful force of American aircraft carriers approached the Japanese coast and fired hundreds of airplanes to strike the remnants of the Japanese fleet at Kure and Kobe. No ships were sunk, but 17 warships were damaged. These included 6 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships, including the Ise and Hyuga, which survived light only to receive bomb hits at the docks of the Kure naval base. Army generals, in defending their point of view, pointed to these damage to the ships, which became even greater after the aircraft carriers struck our bases again on March 20th. The Navy's Fifth Air Fleet, established in February 1945, bombarded American formations with hundreds of kamikaze planes. The commander of the Fifth Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Matome Ogaki, once Chief of Staff to Yamamoto, submitted a report stating, "Our special-purpose aircraft have sunk or severely damaged 7 enemy aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 1 cruiser." This, to put it mildly, greatly exaggerated report helped restore the Navy's badly shaken position in the imperial stakes, but it had the opposite results. Top strategists in Tokyo, who naively believed in the report Ogaki, have insinuated themselves that after such a blow, the enemy carrier group should withdraw to Ulithi for extended repairs, so we should not expect any new active enemy action soon. 3 days later, on March 23rd, hundreds of American deck planes began daily strikes on Okinawa. The island was then subjected to a massive bombardment from American ships, followed, as usual, by the landing of invasion troops. The Emperor's headquarters was shocked, but did nothing. After all, staff analysts had predicted that the Americans were unable to carry out a major landing operation at this time. But this time, the American fleet did not just raid the waters of Okinawa Island, it came to stay. On March 26th, the Imperial headquarters, recovering from the shock, ordered a massive air raid on the enemy ships. The American hordes landed on the shore of Okinawa, effectively meeting no resistance. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the defense of Okinawa, wisely decided that a defense in the interior of the island, out of reach of the fire of the heavy guns of the American ships, would be more effective. On this occasion, the Navy immediately raised an outcry. Why does the Army offer no resistance? To which the Army replied, why didn't the Navy refloat the enemy's ships on the approach to the island? Of course, this kind of scolding could not lead to anything positive, but Admiral Toyoda, who had endured the kicking of the Army generals for 5 months, finally surrendered on April 5th, and 4 days after the American landing on Okinawa began, decided to put the Second Fleet into action. This day, April 5th, was memorable for 2 other important events in Japanese history. The country's Prime Minister, General Kuniaki Koyasu, stepped down and was replaced by retired Admiral Kantaro Suzuki. On the same day, the Soviet Union notified Japan that it was not going to renew the non-aggression treaty. I knew nothing about all this behind-the-scenes business. On that somber morning, the Second Fleet was near Tokuyama in the inland sea. From the bridge of the Yahagi, I gloomily watched the anchored giant Yamato and our 8 destroyers. Our few ships were organized as follows: Second Fleet, Vice Admiral Saichi Ito, Yamato Line Ship, Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga, Second Destroyer Squadron, Rear Admiral Kizo Komura on Yahagi, 17th Destroyer Division, Captain First Rank Kichi Shintani, Isokai's Captain Second Rank Sunio Maeda, Hamakaze, Captain Second Rank Isami Mukoi, Yukikaze, Captain Second Rank Masamichi Torochi, 21st Destroyer Division, Captain First Rank Hisao Kotaki, Asashimo, Captain Second Rank Yoshiro Sujihara, Kesumi, Captain Hiroi Yamana, Hatsushimo, Captain Second Rank Masatsu Sato, 41st Destroyer Division, Captain First Rank Masayoshi Yoshida, Fuyutsuki, Captain Second Rank Hideka Sakuma, the Satsuki, Captain Second Rank Shige Taka Amano. It was all that was left of the once huge Second Fleet. My unhappy thoughts of the former glory and current sorry state of the Second Fleet were interrupted by the appearance of a seaplane from the southeastern direction. The seaplane made a dashing landing in the bay and approached the very side of the Yamato. From the bridge of the Yahagi, I saw several men climb the gangway to the deck of the giant battleship. As I pondered who they might be, a flag signal raised on the Yamato announced, "Commence Operation 10 Go." The sirens and bugles of battle alarm sounded on all ships for Operation 10 Go meant that the fleet would strike the enemy off Okinawa with all its might. Rear Admiral Kizo Komura, who had replaced Kimura and kept his flag on the Yahagi, sharing the bridge with me, was summoned to the Yamato. He hurried to the waiting boat and went to the battleship. I realized that the seaplane had delivered to us some big brass with some very important information. I did not take my eyes off the battleship and was beginning to lose patience, when at 11:30 from Yamato beeped from Admiral Komura to all division commanders and ship commanders. Report to the Yahagi at noon for a meeting. The meeting began at exactly noon. Admiral Komura addressed the group of ship commanders. Gentlemen, you have all seen the signal to begin Operation 10 Go. Vice Admiral Ruinosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, has just arrived from Kanoya for a meeting with the flagships of our fleet. Listening to the Admiral, we 4 captains of the first rank and 8 captains of the second rank remained dead silent. After a brief pause, Komura continued. The operational formula proposed by Admiral Kusaka is so extraordinary that I don't even know what to say. The High Command wants the Second Fleet to proceed to Okinawa without air cover, with fuel reserves sufficient only for the trek to Okinawa, i.e., a one-way trip. In other words, Command wants to use us as kamikazes. Not even like kamikazes, but worse, since kamikaze pilots still have a good chance of hitting a worthwhile target. I told Admiral Kusaka that our small fleet has no chance at all against powerful enemy formations, so his proposed operation is simply suicidal. Aruga and Morishita agreed with me. Admiral Ito didn't say anything, so I don't know his opinion. As you know, I was Ozawa's chief of staff when we acted as decoys off the Philippines and lost 4 aircraft carriers. I've driven our sailors virtually to certain death enough in that war. But so far it's been in the name of something. And here I'm offered to commit suicide with the whole squadron. I'm not very afraid of death, but I don't want to lead my sailors to a completely senseless death. In the end, I asked Admiral Kusaka to delay the order until I know the opinion of my commanders. With those words, Komura fell silent, clenching his teeth and closing his tear-filled eyes. There was a tense silence which I was about to interrupt, as Rose Captain First Rank Aichi Shintani, who a year earlier replaced my friend Miyazaki as commander of the 17th Destroyer Division. He asked, "Does Kusaka want to impose this order on us?" Komura shook his head. "No one can order another to kill himself. Kusaka didn't talk about any order at all. Even if he does have an order, he didn't mention it. He only expressed his opinion and asked for our ideas and comments." Shintani turned purple, took a deep breath, and stated, "I went with Kurita to Leyte the day after the Americans landed. It looked as if the High Command was going to resort once again to that fatal scheme of action involving a fighting breakthrough to enemy-held bridgeheads. Kurita could still hope to succeed, since he had Ozawa as bait. But without a decoy squadron to divert the enemy's main forces, we have no chance of success at all. What Kusaka is proposing is ridiculous. If we try to carry out his plan, we'll just die for nothing. And then who will defend our home islands? I'm against it." "I agree with Shintani," said Captain First Rank Hisao Kodaki, commander of the 21st Destroyer Division. "For many months now, the High Command has done nothing else but breed and pile error after error. Why should we, who have been through so many battles, blindly follow, like a herd of sheep, incompetent and inexperienced leadership?" The commanders of the ships under Shintani and Kodaki made it clear by their approving hums and remarks that they were in full solidarity with the opinions of their division commanders. But Admiral Komura, without uttering a word, continued to sit with his eyes closed. I felt it my duty to express my opinion on the matter as well. Given our current combat capabilities, the only real thing left for us to do is to attack the extremely stretched supply lines of the American fleet. I'd be happy to be allowed to operate as a lone wolf in the ocean. Yahagi is now equipped with radar and sonar, so is quite capable of acting as a lone raider, and it seems to me that we could put at least 6 enemy ships and vessels to bed before we'd be overrun. I took a breath and continued. The accomplishment of such a task seems to me a very worthwhile endeavor, and the proposed march of the entire fleet to Okinawa seems to me like bombarding a rock with chicken eggs. The meeting was interrupted by the appearance of messengers with lunch, which we ate without any appetite. During lunch, the destroyer commanders continued to convince the admiral of our point of view. At 1 p.m., Komura headed back to the Yamato. We remained waiting for him in the Salon Yahagi, gloomily looking at the barely creeping hands of the clock. At 1600 hours, the admiral finally returned. When he entered the salon, his face was haggard and gaunt. The admiral walked slowly to his chair, sat down, and said in a tired, hoarse voice, "I have received orders that went into effect at 15:30. It seemed that by saying this, Komura had thrown a mountain off his shoulders. Then, looking us over one by one, the admiral gave the details of that fateful meeting. I spent an hour reporting your opinion and mine. Kusaka and all the others listened to me attentively without interrupting. When I finished, Kusaka clarified that our march was not a mere suicide, but was precisely a decoy for the enemy. He emphasized that it was not his plan. The plan was devised while he was in Konoya. And the whole plan is based on the fact that when the enemy aircraft carriers release their planes to strike our fleet, they will be hit by hundreds of kamikaze planes flown from the southern airfields of Kyushu Island. Kusaka assured me that this decoy operation would not end as fruitlessly as the one I had recently participated in. Kusaka then turned to Morishita and told me that the High Command, especially the Army, was very disappointed with the Yamato's actions at Leyte when the battleship broke off the battle so abruptly. Kusaka realizes that this is not Morishita's fault. There are no complaints about him. On the contrary, everyone admired the skill with which Morishita managed the ship, dodging so many torpedoes, which Misashi could not do. However, continued Admiral Kusaka, in Tokyo very dissatisfied that the battleship returned home without firing a single shot from his 18-inch on the enemy. Morishita took these remarks very hard. Kusaka then turned to Ariga, saying that the whole nation, all our people would hate the Navy if a battleship like the Yamato survived this war. This, of course, is not Ariga's fault, but it can be remembered that 3 years before the battle in Leyte Gulf, Yamato actually did not participate in the war, and it was already being talked about as a floating department for sick and moronic admirals. Here Admiral Ito interrupted his long silence and said, "I think we are being given a fine chance to die decently. And a samurai should live in such a way that he should always be ready to die." This statement by Ito ended all controversy. When Morishita and then Ariga agreed with Kusaka, I did the same. At the last words, Komura shook his head guiltily, as if apologizing to us. We continued to sit in tense silence, stunned by Admiral Komura's story. When the first impression of Komura's words had passed, I decided to return to reality in this completely unreal situation. "We appreciate the fortitude you have shown on our behalf, Admiral Komura," I said. "But an order is an order. Now we need to carry it out to the best of our ability." Admiral Komura looked at me gratefully and said, "Thank you, Hara." The 3 division commanders Kodaki, Shintani, and Yoshida announced that they accepted the order and turned to their destroyer commanders. Those with glee declared their full agreement with the order. Such an abrupt change of opinion might not be very clear to the European reader. Kusaka himself endeavored to encourage the admirals to learn the views of their officers. But since the order was unprecedented, it could only be carried out if it was accepted. But regardless of everything, we all knew perfectly well that an order in the Imperial Navy was unconditional and non-negotiable. Back on the Yahagi, I assembled all the officers and petty officers on the tank. I explained to them the gist of the order I had received, scrutinizing the faces of each of them. There was certainly a sense of tension in the air, but to my surprise and relief I saw no sign of fear or despair on any face. I concluded by saying, "As you realize, the order we have received is, to put it mildly, not quite ordinary. Therefore, I would like to make the following clear to you. If any of you feel that it would be better for you to skip this trip, you may leave the ship with the cadets, the sick, and anyone else we deem unfit for the task ahead. Therefore, immediately submit to me in the cabin lists of all those who are to be written off the ship." In the cabin, I looked at the picture of my family with a sigh, and remembering that most of the sailors of the Yahagi are family men, I wondered how many of them would take the opportunity to be written off the ship. I did not enjoy in the slightest the prospect of leading nearly 1,000 men to certain death. I was sincerely looking forward to the list of those written off and wanted it to be bigger. So I was surprised when, entering my cabin, my XO-Captain 2nd Rank Uchino reported, "Commander, here's the list. There are 22 cadets and 15 sick." "Is that all, Uchino?" I asked. "And none of the crew did not want to leave the ship?" "No, Commander. Everyone wants to stay and share each other's fate." I went up to the deck, where 37 men written off from the ship were lined up. "You are ordered," I announced, "to abandon ship immediately. I am sure that all of you will still get a chance to fight for the cause of our country. Farewell." As I turned to leave, A very young cadet jumped out of the ranks with a shout. "Mr. Captain First Rank, please let me stay. I won't be a burden to you. I'll do whatever I'm ordered to do." Another cadet was crying his eyes out. "You're driving us away because you think cadets can't do anything. At least leave me to clean the latrines." And then the whole formation exploded with similar requests. To stop it, I announced in an iron voice, "There are orders to save your lives, the lives of the commanders of the future fleet. March ashore." In the evening, we invited aboard the cruiser 3 division commanders and 8 destroyer commanders for a farewell feast. Admiral Komura, becoming in this case a hospitable host, forgetting sorrows and worries, put out of the treasury stocks a huge amount of sake. He personally filled everyone's glasses, and our feast quickly turned into a drunken party, where everyone tried to relax and have fun. We laughed loudly at old, hackneyed jokes, sang songs, showed tricks, demonstrating extraordinary manual dexterity. All this was accompanied by shouts of delight and applause. Meanwhile, the sake supply was running low and no one was drunk. Alcohol did not take anyone. The fun was unnatural. In the end, by about 22 they started to leave, leaving 30 big empty sake bottles on the table. Everyone was sober as they went down the gangway to the waiting dinghies to go to their ships. When the guests had left, Captain Uchino invited Admiral Komura and me to the wardroom, where about 20 of the ship's senior officers had gathered for a feast. We mutually toasted each other after consuming several more liters of sake. We sang naval songs and laughed merrily with the ship's officers, who were more amenable to alcohol than the old sea wolves who were destroyer commanders. Then the Admiral, Uchino, and I went to the junior officers' wardroom, where the farewell feast was also buzzing. We sang a few songs with them and exchanged toasts. By 11:30 p.m., it was over and the officers went to their quarters. When Komura, Uchino, and I were finally alone, I learned that they shared my concern about how the crew of the Yahagi would behave in the bloody nightmare that lay ahead. The officers seemed prepared for anything. And the sailors? We decided to walk through the cockpits. The cramped rooms, lit by the dim light of blue night lamps, were filled with hundreds of hanging bunks. Not a sound could be heard except the snoring of peacefully sleeping sailors. Literally on tiptoe, so as not to disturb anyone, we went back up to the upper deck. Uchino said to me, "The sailors are all right. They sleep like children with full hope and confidence in you. They know that no matter how scary our mission is, you will do your best to take care of them." Some incomprehensible feeling of happiness and elation swept over me. The huge amount of alcohol I drank began to take effect. I felt dizzy, swayed, and suddenly became completely drunk. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I clung to the superstructure and screamed, "Nippon Banzai! Yahagi Banzai! Nippon Banzai! Yahagi Banzai!" That was the last thing I remembered from that unforgettable night. Uchino carried me to my quarters, where I collapsed on my bunk. The next day was Friday, April 6th. I woke up at 0600. The weather was beautiful as I stepped out on deck and took a deep breath of the refreshing sea air. To my surprise, there was no sign of a hangover. My head was clear and clear. Work was simmering on all the ships. From Yahaga, it was still necessary to take off a lot of cargo, which we did not need in the last campaign. Barges and lighters were constantly coming on board. "Good morning," Commander Uchino greeted me. "Good morning, Uchino. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Too beautiful, Commander." At 1 a B-29 flew over the base, and at 4 2 more. "The enemy is keeping a close eye on our compound." I nodded silently. It was exactly what I expected. After standing on deck for a few minutes looking at the shore, I went down to the cabin. It was going to be a busy day, and there was no time to waste. The ship lived up to its usual routine. After the morning cleaning, the crew lined the deck, saluting the flag of the rising sun raised on the cruiser's gaff. At 10, my messenger arrived and reported, "Mr. Captain First Rank Hara, in 15 minutes the last boat is going ashore. Is there anything you'd like to send with it?" "I have nothing to send, son," I replied. "Nothing at all." As the messenger left, I suddenly thought I should send a farewell letter to my family. I had so much I wanted to say to them, and time was flying so fast that I hastily wrote a few lines. which my wife has preserved to this day. In the past 2 years, the combined fleet has shrunk to an incredible size. I am preparing to go into battle as commander of the only remaining in-service cruiser Yahagi of 8,500 tons displacement. With me is my good old friend Rear Admiral Kizo Komura, with whom we will fight in a special-purpose surface ship detachment. It imposes great responsibility and is a great honor for me to be the ship's commander on this campaign to Okinawa. I am happy and proud of this opportunity. Be proud of me. Goodbye. I sealed the letter and jogged down the gangway to the dinghy that was already departing. Back in the cabin, I realized that all the excitement and fears had vanished somewhere. I no longer thought of our trip as a suicidal action, but was determined to fight to the last man. In the porthole of my cabin, I could see the destroyers of our squadron standing nearby. I looked at them, remembering the fire and hell these surviving ships had been through. Yukikaze came out unscathed from many fierce battles. It rivaled my Shiga for the nickname Indestructible and Unsinkable. I remembered the song that was so popular on Truk and in Rabol. From Seisbo's Shiga, Yukikaze on Kyo. 2 immortal destroyers at our side. Under the storm of war, they returned from battle, without loss or damage more than once. This song at one time raised the morale of my sailors. Now Shiga was already dead, so it was left to Yukikaze alone to perform miracles. At 16 was given the signal to drop anchor, and 10 ships of the Second Fleet began their famous campaign in one direction. In front of the group went Yahagi, followed by 3 destroyers of the type Windai Sakai's, Hamakaze, Yukikaze. The winds were followed by Yamato between 2 moons Fuotsuki and Satsutsuki. The Asashimo Kasumi and Hatsushimo made up the rearguard. As we slowly followed the strait at a speed of 12 knots to avoid mines, I looked from the bridge of Yahagi, our small column, a column of ships, and suddenly realized that this is the last time the ships of the Imperial Navy went to sea. And I was overcome with pride that I was following ahead of everyone else. As we passed the narrow strait, we increased our speed. The danger of mines had passed, but there was a new one. 2 bombers B-29, going at high altitude outside the range of fire of our anti-aircraft guns, dropped several bombs on our group. They did not achieve hits, but this bombing served as an ominous warning of what lay ahead of us. I remembered with dismay that of our 10 ships. Only the Yamato and 2 destroyers had air target detection radar. The equipment installed on the Yahagi could only detect surface ships. On all ships, crews were summoned to the upper deck. Over 1,000 men lined the spacious deck of the Yahagi to listen to the orders Admiral Toyoda had received over the radio. The Imperial Navy is launching a general offensive against the enemy off Okinawa in cooperation with all air, sea and land forces of Japan, to make this operation the turning point of the war. It is expected that every unit and every warrior, fighting courageously, will destroy the enemy and ensure the continued glorious existence of our eternal empire. The fate of our nation depends on this operation. There was dead silence, broken only by the murmur of the ship's machinery, the splash of the waves and the flapping in the wind of our battle flag of the rising sun hoisted on the gaff. After reading the order, I turned to the crew. You know that hundreds of our comrades have already given their lives flying to the enemy in explosive-laden airplanes with fuel to one side. Thousands more are now on standby at airfields to follow them. Hundreds of our comrades take their places on submarines in manned torpedoes. Thousands more are leading exploding boats into battle or sitting in bells at the bottom of the sea, ready to explode when enemy ship passes over them. On this campaign, we will have to do the same. The task assigned to us looks suicidal, and I will not hide from you it is. But I want to emphasize the most important point: the goal is not our suicide. The goal is victory. You are not sheep being dragged to the altar of sacrifice. We are lions released into the arena to tear apart the enemy's gladiators. You are not being led to the slaughter, but are being asked to sacrifice for the nation. Therefore, there's no shame in coming back alive. If our ship is lost, try to save yourselves for the battles to come. There will be many more. And remember that our goal is not suicide, but the defeat of the enemy. The pale spring moon, breaking between the clouds, cast a ghostly light on the line of sailors standing motionless and silent, making them look like statues. An almost visible tension hovered over the formation and was abruptly interrupted by a triple banzai for the Emperor and the Yahagi. Going to our deaths, we continued nevertheless our daily drills. The notional enemy was the Yamato, and all the ships of her escort would go out on a torpedo attack against her, rehearsing what we were going to do to the American ships the next day. For the first time, I had the opportunity to test Yahagi in full combat mode, accelerating the cruiser, albeit briefly, to 35 knots. Soon our radio operators intercepted the work of the enemy radio station, located, judging by the clarity of reception, somewhere close to us. There was no doubt that we were being followed by an enemy submarine, and maybe more than one. Orders came from the Yamato to form up in an anti-submarine order and keep close to Kyushu Island under the protection of its eastern coast. The signalman peered intensely into the darkness, but saw nothing. Everyone was on alert at battle stations, but the submarine attack never came. That night I did not yet know that in the East China Sea American planes sank my old glorious destroyer Amatsukaz, as if in prelude to the disaster that awaited us. But even if I had known about it, all my thoughts were focused on ensuring success in the upcoming operation. Clinging to the southeastern shore of Kyushu Island, we followed the keel column on a zigzag at a speed of 20 knots. On April 7th at 07:00 we changed course to 210 degrees, as if heading for Seibo on the northwest tip of Kyushu. At the course change, all ships rearranged themselves in a circular order around the Yamato with a radius of 2,000 meters. Yahagi went directly ahead of the battleship. Counting from US clockwise on the clock face, destroyers were located as follows: Asashimo 7.5 minutes, Kasumi 15 minutes, Fuotsuki 21 minutes, Hatsushimo 27 minutes, Yukikaze 33 minutes, Satsuki 3 minutes, Hamakaze 45 minutes, and Isoke's 52.5 minutes. Having formed a circular order, the ships increased speed to 24 knots and proceeded to zigzag. The first zig was a 45-degree turn to the right and brought Asashimo to the leading position. The subsequent zig with a 90-degree turn put Isoke's in the lead. Movement in a circular order required exceptional precision in maneuvering, but provided good protection from submarine attacks. But moving in a circular order in a zigzag pattern was not very effective against airstrikes, as aircraft could quickly change the angle of approach to the target using their large speed advantage. Going in a circular zigzag order was decided in a meeting with Admiral Ito immediately after the order was issued. We were soon to see that this decision was wrong. After turning south into the East China Sea, the shores of Kyushu Island quickly melted behind us. For the first time since we left the base, I was overcome with a sense of unease. The worst weather was setting in for the surface ship battle we had planned. Visibility of 20,000 meters gave a great advantage to the enemy with their superior radars. Of course, a torrential squall could have helped us a lot too, but I knew it was unlikely to be expected at this latitude. At that moment, the Yahagi signalman joyfully announced the appearance of 20 of our Zero fighters in the sky. Flying from a northerly direction, they passed low over our ships and began circling above them, then disappearing into the clouds, then emerging from them. Uchino wondered if Command had been generous enough to send us air cover. No, Uchino, Admiral Komura sighed. They're not for us. We shouldn't have air cover. This is just an ordinary training flight. Kusaka must have specifically ordered these young pilots to fly over and say goodbye. After the words of the Admiral on the bridge established a somber silence. Soon 2 unidentified airplanes were detected in a northerly direction. Uchino angrily muttered, "Why don't our Zeros drive off the enemy planes?" "Calm down." Uchino Admiral Komura replied calmly. "Temper your fervor. You know as well as I do what chances our young pilots have against the most experienced American pilots." The clouds thickened, the weather continued to deteriorate, and at about 08:00 hours it began to drizzle. Our circular order continued to push hard toward our destiny under constant observation of enemy scout planes. And not far away from them our fighters were quietly completing their training flights. I had never seen anything like this during the whole war. It was something absolutely supernatural. At 09:00 the destroyer Asashimo, coming from the right of Yahagi, suddenly began to lag behind. I thought I could clearly see through my binoculars the excitement and anger on the face of my old friend Sujihara on the bridge of the destroyer. As Ashimo raised the machine breakdown signal, the destroyer was falling further and further behind, producing a gap in our circular order. Our radio suddenly began receiving enemy reports, this time transmitted from aircraft somewhere nearby. It became clear that all the tricks with false courses did not work. The Americans knew exactly where to look for us. A pleasant surprise was the appearance of 3 steamships of about 2,000 tons displacement on our port side. They greeted us cheerfully. Someone on the bridge was perplexed and remarked that he had no idea that we were still dragging troop transports behind us. At 11:30, at a range of 20,000 meters, a flying boat was sighted to the east. Keeping a safe distance, the boat circled lazily over our ships, giving detailed information on all our maneuvers. That's what it means not to have fighter cover. We had only to watch in impotent anger as the American flying boat circled above us beyond the range of our anti-aircraft artillery. Suddenly the radio announced, "The Amami Oshima signal station reports 250 enemy planes heading north." "They're coming," said Admiral Komura with an ominous smile. Amami Oshima is an island lying halfway between Kyushu and Okinawa. Without looking at a map, every officer on the bridge knew that those planes would be over us in about an hour. Yamato ordered the distance between the ships to be increased to 5,000 meters. Standard procedure when threatened with an air attack. Yahagi and 7 destroyers fan out, preparing for battle. 6 150mm, 4 80mm Yahagi guns and 40 anti-aircraft guns stared their barrels into the sky. Ammunition was fed to the guns and the gunners were in full readiness to fire. It was noon, but there was still no sign of American planes, and I ordered the messengers to bring lunch to the battle stations. Everyone ate quickly, washing down their lunch with hot green tea. With great satisfaction I watched the actions of my crew from the bridge. All worries and doubts had vanished. I knew that Yahagi would not disgrace herself in the upcoming battle. At 12:20, the Yamato reported that its radar had detected a large group of aircraft at a distance of 30,000 meters on a bearing of 35 degrees from the port side. The order followed for all ships to give full sail and prepare to repel the air raid. There was no longer any need for such orders. All ships were already going at a speed of 30 knots. Together with Admiral Komura and other officers, we were at the Air Defense Command post behind the bridge. Yamato, carrying a huge boom on its bow, was also going at its maximum speed. How many times had we seen it? But again we froze with mystical terror, watching this 72,000-ton armored monster being carried across the sea. Our faith in the Yamato was almost religious. This feeling was further strengthened when the battleship returned unharmed from Leyte Gulf, although its identical twin, the Musashi, was lost in that battle. Even from the height of the Air Defense Command post, we still could not see any aircraft approaching. The lower edge of the clouds dropped to 1,500 meters, and a sudden downpour of rain covered everything around us with an impenetrable curtain. It was hard to think of a worse situation. The planes should have already been directly above us above the clouds. The radar of our cruiser, as I have already said, was good only against surface targets. It was completely impossible to use it against airplanes. I thought with horror that if the planes now rushed at us from the clouds, our manually operated guns would not even have time to point at them properly. These mournful thoughts were blown out of my head by the shout of the signalman. 2 airplanes on the left bow. I looked in the direction indicated, but saw not 2, but 20, 30, 40 and more airplanes dropping from the clouds like wasps from a nest. It was 12:32 when I gave the order to open fire. I expected the planes to immediately rush at us. Instead, they began circling clockwise, keeping below the edge of the clouds. These strange movements of the Americans were completely incomprehensible. The astonished gun crews stopped firing, watching the enemy and trying to more accurately determine the distance to the planes. The airplanes continued to circle over us. Apparently the enemy, quite confident, methodically selected and distributed among themselves potential victims, dividing targets between different squadrons. Our ships were still firing sporadically at the lazily circling Americans. 918.1 Yamato main caliber guns roared, firing several special Type 3 shells at the planes, which exploded in the air in huge caps, but with great underflight. Suddenly the planes turned around and with a roar went straight down on their chosen targets. Many of the ship's guns did not yet have clear firing data. The first to pounce on the Yahagi were 4 Avenger torpedo carriers. Our cruiser rattled and rattled, firing from all guns, almost without aiming, putting a fire screen approaching from the left side of the bombers. I sharply put the rudder to the right, noting with pleasure how perfectly Yahagi obeyed the rudder. The bombs fell about 500 meters from us, raising huge columns of water around us. There were no hits. In the next group, several Hellcat fighters came in on the cruiser in a steep dive, exiting just 10 meters above our masts. At this point, I got a clear look at one of the American pilots as he tried to stab our bridge with a large caliber machine gun burst. The other fighter ran a line the length of the ship, but fortunately it didn't hit anyone. We shot back furiously, but we didn't hit anyone either. I took a quick look around. All the ships, desperately maneuvering at full power, raising clouds of spray, burying in the waves and flying out of them, were firing furiously from all guns. My glance noted the white foam ominous traces of aviation torpedoes coming from different directions. Right rudder. Full ahead. I commanded, watching as a dozen more planes began to fall almost vertically on the cruiser. Black bombs, raising huge geysers of water, fell 100 meters from us. Behind the bombers came the fighters again, showering us with cannon and machine gun fire and blasting us with air spray from their propellers as they flew by at the height of our masts. The Yahagi guns were putting a curtain of fire and steel around the cruiser, but neither side had yet achieved hits. A fourth group of attacking planes appeared just as the radio came in from the straggling destroyer Asashimo that she was also under attack. I had no time to think about that lone mangled ship as I commanded the helm, trying with all my might to avoid being hit. Once again we managed to get through the downpour of bombs and bullets without taking any damage. And then I thought of the Asashimo again. What's wrong with it? With a breakdown in the machine, Sugihara has little chance of fighting off the enemy planes. Up ahead, the Yamato was ploughing through the sea at full speed. To his right and left, destroyers circled desperately, appearing and disappearing in the waves, covered by columns of water from close bursts of bombs and the ominous black smoke mushrooms of direct hits. Another wave of airplanes, keeping low over the water, rushed toward us. I barely had time to give the helm command before a close burst of bombs tossed the ship, but we were still in one piece. I felt some relief that our steep circulations and unthinkable zigzags had so far effectively enabled us to dodge the American attacks. Through the rattle of the guns, I heard the desperate cry of the signalman. Torpedoes on the port side. I gave the command to steer, watching with bated breath as, only 100 yards away, 3 torpedo trails came straight at the cruiser. The Avengers that had dropped them swept over the deck, roaring their engines in defiant triumph. Without taking my eyes off, I followed these supernatural serpents of approaching foam. The Yahagi screeched and whirred again with a sudden change of rudder, and then bounced in the water like a wounded horse when a torpedo struck her port side just amidships, just below the waterline. I still can't believe what happened next. Yahagi, like a blind madman, for a few more minutes went somewhere, wagging to the right, then to the left, and suddenly shuddering, stopped abruptly and fearfully. It was inconceivable that a ship of that size, travelling at full speed, could so suddenly be rendered ineffective by the impact of a single torpedo. I was even more dumbfounded when I looked at my watch, not believing my eyes. It was 12:46. We'd only been fighting for 12 minutes. I tried to shout to the engine room over the intercom, demanding a damage report. No one answered. I called the engine room by telephone, but the result was the same. Realizing that the torpedo had hit the engine room, I literally howled with anger. But the enemy was not going to give me time to show my feelings. 6 more bombers were coming in a steep dive at the ship. I saw one of the bombs hit the half-tank, and exploding, destroyed all the people there. By the force of the explosion, about half a dozen bodies were blown into the air and thrown overboard. The Yahagi jerked sharply aft from the explosion, its entire hull shuddering with a terrifying screech. Biting my lip in impotent rage, I remembered the sinking of the Tokyo Maru from a single torpedo that had struck the engine room. I also remembered that the mighty British ships Rifles and Prince of Wales had been quickly sunk by a much smaller air force than the one now attacking us. Breathing heavily, a messenger ran onto the bridge. A torpedo exploded right in the middle of the engine room. Commander. The room is flooded. Everyone in it is dead. Are the bulkheads holding? The survivability division is trying to stop the water, Commander. The cruiser was tilting noticeably to starboard. I heard Admiral Kimura's voice shouting, "Hamikaze's dead." Glancing to the left, I caught a glimpse of the bottom of the destroyer, painted with red sulfur, going underwater. We had not even had time to give the wounded first aid before a new attack began. Uchino rushed down the gangway giving orders to the anti-aircraft gun crews. That was the last time I saw my glorious XO. All the remaining intact guns opened a barrage of fire. And finally, for the first time in this battle, I saw 2 enemy planes, engulfed in flames, crash into the water. One after another, groups of American bombers and torpedo carriers made approaches to our lying motionless, battered cruiser. Without turning from the combat course, the planes went straight through the veil of barrage anti-aircraft fire. Enemy pilots, of course, were real warriors. Mortally wounded Yahagi shuddered again, as if in convulsions from a terrible explosion at the stern. I looked back and saw the mangled bodies of my sailors thrown 60 feet high by the explosion. At that moment, another torpedo exploded in the starboard bow of the cruiser. Yahagi bucked and seemed to scream in pain. Clinging to the handrails of the vibrating and sagging command center bridge, I watched as the torpedo explosion formed a huge hole in the cruiser's bow, and the ship's roll began to increase. Another group of bombers and attack aircraft began their approach from the forward course angles of the Yahagi. The deafening crackle of large-caliber machine guns, which seemed to have no end, ended with the rumble of a bomb explosion that destroyed the No. 1 main-caliber turret with all personnel and sailors on the tank by a direct hit. Strangely enough, no one on the bridge or at the control room was even wounded, but so many rivets flew out of the steel plates of the superstructure that all the structures loosened, the bridge shook like an epileptic, and was ready to collapse at any moment. A 100-kilogram bomb, which hit the half-bank, broke through the thin deck armor, caused a fire in the battle cellars of the forward main-caliber turrets. Acrid yellow smoke billowed from beneath the split deck. In the midst of all this horror, I was surprised to hear the calm voice of the artillery officer, LT Hutt, ordering the bow cellars to be flooded. Interestingly, after all the hits, the cellar flooding system was still in operation. And it did, because the fire had been extinguished and smoke had stopped billowing from below deck. If the cellars had exploded, no one would have had any chance of escape. I awoke to horror when I heard my name called over the intercom. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Kamiyama, a mine officer, was calling the bridge, requesting permission to discharge the torpedo tubes. If they explode, he explained, they'll blow the whole ship. All right, I shouted back, release all the fish. Almost immediately, 16 powerful homing torpedoes slid into the water, unarmed and with locked engines. They sank at once, and I was annoyed to think what damage these powerful weapons would have done to the enemy, which we had to throw away without any use. Kamiyama was in time. Hardly had the last torpedo gone into the water when the bomb struck the torpedo apparatus. The explosion collapsed the aft mast. Looking out from the still miraculously surviving bridge, I saw that our catapult was smashed and turned into a pile of mangled scrap metal. The airplane that had been standing on the catapult a moment ago had turned into a shapeless mass of smoking wreckage. A few guns with burned and bleeding commandos were still firing sporadically at the airplanes. I saw a whole squadron of Avengers streaming low over the water, coming at the cruiser, dropping torpedoes and sweeping over the dying ship with a roar. How many of these torpedoes hit the cruiser? I could no longer say for sure. 3, 4, maybe more. Our dying ship shuddered from the explosions, lurching more and more. The waves were already lapping the upper deck, washing away pools of blood. Several mutilated bodies rolled straight off the deck into the sea. Suddenly there was silence. The second wave of about 100 American planes, having done their job, built right over our heads and took a course back to their aircraft carriers. And my proud cruiser turned into a pile of ruins, barely kept afloat. All the gun emplacements had been destroyed. Amazing, it flashed through my mind that there were no fires. Like a vision in my inflamed brain suddenly appeared the American cruiser San Francisco, a mangled half-ghost, which my destroyer Amatsukaze almost collided with in the pitch blackness of the night battle at Santa Cruz. Now my Yahagi had become a ghost as well. Only mutilated bodies were visible on the upper deck. It was as if everything had died out. And on the bridge, not a single person was even wounded. Admiral Komura turned to me. I think we'd better get out of here. It looks like if we don't do it now, we never will. It seems to me that the 250 American planes reported from Amami-Oshima have already done their job. I had nothing to reply to that. I bowed and muttered, "Pardon me, Admiral." "Wouldn't it be better," Komura continued, "to transfer my flag to one of the destroyers and continue to make our way to our objective off Okinawa? What do you think of that?" "What can I say, pressed by the terrible responsibility for the loss of my ship?" "Look," Hara shouted the Admiral, "the Isokase is still intact." I was amazed to see the destroyer to our left, about 3,000 meters away, right in its original position of our scattered circular order. The destroyer appeared to be still in good shape, and was heading in our direction. The sight of the Isokase coming full speed toward us was one of the few encouraging moments of this battle. "Signalers," I ordered. "Raise the signal. Isokase to come aboard. Receive the Admiral, everyone prepare to abandon ship." The signal was transmitted by searchlight from the bridge and duplicated by flag semaphore. The abandoned ship order was transmitted throughout the facilities and the surviving crew members began to prepare to evacuate. Having received the signal, Isokase began to rapidly approach the mangled hull of our cruiser. In 1,000 meters from Yahaga, Isokase slowed down and cautiously began to approach closer and closer. I gave the order to abandon ship. But at the same minute there was a shrill shout from the signalman enemy planes, and in a moment we saw the approach of the third wave, about 100 fighters and bombers. Isokase was only 200 meters away from us. The bulk of the planes pounced on Yamato, but a dozen or two, out of order, rushed at us and the standing next to helpless in its immobility destroyer. Gaining momentum, Isokase began to move away from us, laying sharp circulation. But airplanes were coming from all directions, showering it with a shower of bombs, firing from cannons and machine guns. Isokase disappeared in a blaze of bursts and clouds of thick black smoke. You could say that Yahagi ruined his own destroyer. It almost happened to my Shiga when the cruiser Sendai came under murderous attack in Empress Augusta Bay. But I then refused to abandon my destroyer to the slaughter and now hoped that the Isokase would ignore my signal to save herself. Thinking, apparently, that the destroyer was finished, the planes decided to tackle what was left of the Yahagi. Our still afloat pile of scrap metal again began to scrape and squirm under the murderous bursts of aircraft guns. Unable to do anything about it, I stood desperately clutching the bridge rail. The Yahaga's death convulsions were subsiding. I looked up and, to my great surprise, saw Isokase emerging from an impenetrable wall of fallen water columns and scattered smoke. He was wounded but still alive, moving away from us at full speed. But again the planes appeared above it, and the destroyer again disappeared in puffs of smoke and vapor. After dropping bombs on Isokase and leaving the attack, every enemy plane passed over the sinking Yahagi, shelling it with guns and machine guns. There was nothing we could do with them. We had only to send them curses and hold on. Lieutenant Yukio Matsuda, the navigating officer, supervised the removal of the wounded to the lifeboat. This was noticed from the enemy fighters, who did not rest until they had smashed the dinghy to pieces, drowning in their own blood the 13 poor wounded sailors lying there. The men jumped overboard, but the enemy gave not a moment's respite. A fourth wave of 100 airplanes appeared and began to destroy in general everything that moved and moved. Admiral Komura, a few officers and I continued to stand on the bridge, which was still intact, still overlooking the pitiful ruins of what had recently been called the light cruiser Yahagi. As I looked out to sea, I realized that the Isokase was badly crippled. The destroyer's speed had dropped, and although there was no fire, the ship was going like a drunk. The Satsuki was seen farther away, all engulfed in flames and puffs of black smoke. Kasumi was spinning helplessly in place, raising the signal, "Can't steer." Yamato seemed to be still in good shape. At a distance of 3 miles, of course, I could not see its damage, nor was I aware that the pride of our fleet was in the same condition as the Yahagi. The destroyers Yukikaze Fuyutsuki were spinning alongside in a vain attempt to cover the huge battleship. The fifth wave, consisting of over 100 airplanes, also did not spare the Yahagi in its agony. Bullets whistled all around me. Not caring about anything, almost completely lost in thought, I kissed through clenched teeth. "All right, you Yankee bastards. Finish us off." I was brought back to my senses by the whistle of bullets and a sudden pain in my arm. I woke up, looked at the slight wound on my left arm, and then noticed that the water was already splashing on the deck of the command post, where Kimura and I were alone. "What's up, Hara?" "We need to leave," the Admiral said calmly. "Let's go," we replied. As we took off our boots, I noted the time. It was 14:06. The airplanes continued to roar overhead. The waves were already up to our knees when we jumped overboard. I had only managed to swim a few meters when some giant, invisible force began to drag me underwater. I resisted and struggled as hard as I could, but the sucking whirlpool of the sinking ship was inexorable. I realized that there was no escape. I stopped resisting, and a terrible force pulled me under the water. The next thing I clearly felt was that the monstrous force that was pulling me into the abyss suddenly released me from its grip. I was tossing and twisting. There was pitch blackness all around me, but nothing was pulling me down. Suddenly I saw a mass of blue orbs near my face, moving upward. They were air bubbles from my clothes and my lungs. Gasping, I took a huge gulp of seawater, and then my head popped to the surface. I inhaled the air deeply, finding myself in an eerie void where there was no sound, no light, no sensation. There was nothing. I still managed to stay afloat without realizing what I was doing. Gradually, my eyes began to distinguish something, above all daylight. An indistinct buzzing sound suddenly turned into human voices, and looking around, I saw several heads on the surface. They were all black. In my disturbed mind, I thought they were Negroes who had come to bathe on the same beach as me. I was still in a kind of prostration. The fatigue and strain of the 2-hour battle, the disaster that followed, must have thrown me into a shock from which there was no quick escape. Then I heard someone scream. "Hara. What's wrong with you? Hara. Can you hear me?" I turned around in the direction of the voice and saw the black face of the man who had shouted to me, recognizing in him the unexpected Admiral Kimura. His weathered and tanned face was itself so dark that it was recognizable from 10 meters away, even though everything was covered in a thick layer of fuel oil. "I'm fine, Kimura," I replied. "And how are you?" "Everything is perfectly fine," said the Admiral. So the Negroes around me turned out to be sailors from my crew. I ran my hand over my face and saw that the whole palm of my hand was covered with a thick layer of fuel oil. The entire surface of the water was covered with fuel oil from the broken tanks of the wrecked Yahagi. To my surprise, there were a lot of sailors from the Yahagi around, holding on to floating debris and pieces of wood. And I thought my entire crew was dead. When my sight returned to me, I caught a glimpse of the Yamato, which looked huge and majestic even at 6 miles. The wave that came over me hid the battleship, but the next one, lifting me up, allowed me to see a whole swarm of airplanes circling over the Yamato like mosquitoes. As I swam, I came across a small log, grabbed hold of it, hugged it, and caught my breath. Now that I was relatively safe, I could think about what to do next. "Hey, move over. Give me a seat," came a voice behind me. A young sailor was trying to reach the log. I moved aside, giving him a chance to grab the log. "Who are you?" "What's your name?" he asked, catching his breath. "My name is Hara. I'm from Yahagi," I replied. My new neighbor was dazed and speechless, staring at me in a kind of trance. "I'm sorry, mister. Captain First Rank," he mumbled. "I apologize for my rudeness. I'm a Daiwa second-class sailor. I'd better look for another log, mister. Captain First Rank. This one may not hold both of us." He looked around anxiously, but I said, "Don't be silly, son. Hold on tight. Let's try to save ourselves. Are you hurt?" "No. My friend Asamo and I, when the cruiser was hit, decided to die quickly and went down into cellar 3, hoping it would explode and tear us to pieces. But then Chief Petty Officer Hamada appeared in the cellar and ordered us up on deck. He was so furious that we ran up the gangway. I tripped and sprained a ligament in my leg. But that's okay. I don't know what happened to Hamada and my buddy Asamo." "Don't worry about anything," I advised. "All you can think about right now is saving yourself. And you will be saved if you want to be saved." We looked around and saw the Yamato still running. What a beautiful move it was. Suddenly a column of smoke rose from somewhere around the battleship's waterline, enveloping the entire ship and making it look like Mount Fujiyama with a snow-covered peak. We both screamed in terror. Following the white smoke came black smoke, the column of which, enveloping the ship, a huge mushroom rose to a height of about 2,000 meters. When the smoke cleared, we saw that there was nothing on the surface of the water. The Yamato had disappeared. The terrible explosion that occurred at 2:23 p.m. on the 7th day of April 1945 signaled the end of the unsinkable symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy. After the war, my friend Rear Admiral Nobuo Morishita, who turned out to be one of the 269 rescued from the Yamato, told me the details of the battleship's final minutes. He received the first direct hit by bombs, and 10 minutes later in the left side of the ship hit the first torpedo. In all, 8 more torpedoes hit the battleship's port side and 2 more hit the starboard, port side. Captain First Rank Jiro Nomura, Senior Assistant Commander of the Yamato, at 14:05 made sure that the roll of the ship cannot be leveled and reported to the commander. Vice Admiral Ito, who had been on the bridge during the entire battle, then declared the operation over and ordered the ship to abandon ship. The destroyer Fyotsuki was ordered to come aboard and assist in evacuating the crew. But the perishing mastodon sank faster than the destroyer approached the board. The commander of the Fyotsuki, Captain Second Rank Heidichi Kasakuma, kept his distance, fearing his ship would be sucked into the maelstrom. Admiral Ito exchanged handshakes with the officers on the bridge and retired to his quarters to die with his ship. Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga, commander of the Yamato, tied himself to the Nakutos on the bridge to also share the ship's fate. Morishita argued vehemently with the other officers who wanted to follow their commander's example. He managed to convince them, and together they left the bridge. The ship was already falling on its port side when at 14:17 the last torpedo hit it. 3 minutes later, an explosion followed, sending the battleship to the bottom. That explosion saved Morishita by throwing her into the sea. Holding onto the log, I seemed to forget myself again, mourning the loss of my ship and the loss of the Yamato. When I woke up and looked around, I found neither Komura nor young Daiva, who was no longer holding on to the opposite end of the log. There was no one nearby at all. My hands were getting colder and colder, and I could no longer hold on to the log. Something floated up to me, and I saw a piece of black paper. For some reason I took it and stuffed it in my pocket. Something else bumped against me. I pulled back and saw about 1.5 meters of excellent thin rope. Where it came from I don't know, but I was very happy as I got the opportunity to tie myself to the log. Now, even if I die, the log will keep me on the surface, and maybe the waves will throw my body onto the shore of Japan. The airplanes appeared in the sky again. This was probably the last attacking wave, but in my ever-increasing stupor and indifference, this fact interested me little. The stupor continued until American fighter planes began firing at the Japanese sailors floating in the water. A few bullets whistled in my direction as well, bringing me out of my forgetfulness, thanks to the truly beastly hatred I felt for the American pilots. It brought me to my senses, and even my numb hands began to act again. The enemy fighters disappeared, but, to my great surprise, suddenly appeared an enemy flying boat type Martin, landing literally 300 meters from me. I dived, but no one on the RVM paid any attention to me. Martin, leaving behind him a path of emerald water, approached the life raft, where there was a downed American pilot, took him on board and took off again. I watched all this with a sense of envy. As I later found out, even closer to the flying boat was one of my officers, LT, Shijo Yamada. He was born in Hawaii, spoke excellent English, and had served on the Yahagi as a communications officer. He later confided to me I was afraid of being captured because I was nominally considered a US citizen and could be shot. I frantically tore off all the insignia from my uniform and threw them into the sea, but the flying boat, almost hitting me, taxied past. Yamada survived the war and in 1958 was already working in the Chicago branch of a Japanese airline, something he could hardly have foreseen on that April day in 1945. After the Martin flew away, I suddenly became completely calm and began to recall the events of the day. I thought that very clumsily, one might say clumsily maneuvered the cruiser, dodging bombs and torpedoes. On a destroyer, I would no doubt have come out of this battle without any damage. Apparently, for my caliber, I was a destroyer commander, but nothing more. What had I done wrong? Why had I forgotten the maneuvering tactics I had so successfully employed at Kavieng when the Siga was raided by enemy aircraft? The Yahagi was much faster and more maneuverable than the Siga. Why did I lead the cruiser in such an outdated evasive maneuver as a zigzag, which allowed the torpedo to finish us off? I must have been very disqualified after a year of shore duty. I no longer had any idea how many hours had passed since the loss of the Yahagi. It was getting dark and the wind was picking up. I stiffened from the cold and fought drowsiness, knowing that if I fell asleep I would never wake up again. Around me I saw nothing but the running waves and heard nothing but the splashing of water against my log. Finally my eyes closed, my head fell on the wet wood of the log, and I fell asleep. In my dream I saw myself going from Shikoku to Honshu for the first time in my life to take examinations at the naval school. I was on a motorboat, and the sound of its engine was clearly echoing in my ears, so clearly that it is not like a dream. With difficulty I opened my eyes, but the sound of the engine running continued to echo clearly in my ears. About a mile away I saw a destroyer that I thought was still fighting off the planes. My head fell back on the log, but the sound of the engine prevented me from forgetting again it was so distinct that it could not have come from the distant destroyer. I raised my head again and saw the boat. A regular small motorboat from the destroyer, clearly visible between the tops of the waves just 200 meters away from me. Then it disappeared. I raised my head, looking for it with my eyes. After a few minutes, the boat reappeared, this time only 50 meters from me. The boat was going in circles, looking for survivors of the carnage. I was gripped by terror. Suddenly I wanted to live, and I was terrified that the boat would not find me. I screamed with all the strength of my lungs, but the boat completed the circle without seeing me. In desperation, I untied myself from the log and started kicking the water with my arms and legs. It worked. From the speedboat, they noticed the splashes and turned in my direction, but it seemed like an eternity before the boat came toward me. I didn't even have the strength to catch the lifeline or grab onto the side of the boat, but 4 strong arms quickly dragged me aboard. Strangely enough, once on the boat, I felt a rush of new strength. My deadly fatigue had vanished. I thanked my rescuers and was very surprised to find that there were no other rescuers on board except me. The petty officer commanding the boat explained to me that they had already rescued and brought many to the destroyer, and this was their last trip. The boat continued searching for another 15 minutes and, finding no one else, headed back to the USS Hatsushimo. I must have vastly overestimated my strength, because as I tried to climb up the gangway I found that my legs were ineffective. 2 big sailors dragged me up onto the deck. The commander of the destroyer, Captain 2nd Rank Masatsu Sato, welcomed me. "Welcome home, Captain 1st Rank Hara. We were almost desperate to find you. Admiral Komura is resting in my quarters." I mumbled words of thanks in return, glad that the darkness was hiding my face, which apparently reflected how bad I was feeling. Sato sent me to the infirmary, where I was changed into dry clothes. An experienced orderly gave me first aid and a massage that quickly restored my strength. I thanked him and asked for a glass of vodka. The doctor laughed and said, "At another time I would have objected, but now, Captain Hara, I'm sure a glass of sake is all you need." The liquor brought me back to life completely. Then I was given a cup of hot broth. While I drank it, the doctor briefed me on the events on their ship. I'm afraid, he began, that the Hatsushimo didn't contribute much to the battle. The Americans flew over us to strike the Yamato, paying little attention to our destroyer, so that we escaped direct hits. 2 of our sailors were lightly wounded, but there were no killed. Hatsushimo seemed to be the only ship of the compound that did not take any damage. That's why we were left to pick up the survivors. Fuyutsuki, Satsuki, and Yukikaze all took damage and left 2 hours ago for Seisbu. Fuyutsuki is not in bad shape. It was hit by 2 missiles, neither of which exploded, but a dozen of its sailors were killed by machine gun fire from the fighters. Yukikaze was also lightly damaged and lost 3 sailors to air fire. Satsutsuki received a bomb hit that tore off its nose, and it went stern first into Seisbu. Isoke's was not so lucky. It had no direct hits, but close bomb bursts caused such underwater damage that the destroyer flooded the engine room and killed 100 crewmen. The ship eventually sank and the crew transferred to the Yukikais. Kasumi was heavily damaged and had 17 men killed. The crew transferred to the Fuotsuki, which finished it off with artillery fire. I thanked the doctor for the information and lastly asked if there was a sailor named Daiva among the rescued. The doctor checked the list and replied, "Yes, he is on the list. We picked him up 2 hours ago and he kept asking about you." Summoning a messenger, the medic ordered, "Tell Daiva that Captain First Rank Hara has been rescued." The destroyer Hatsushimo, with hundreds rescued from Yamato and Yahagi on board, returned to Seispei around noon on April 8th. He read it, grimaced, and handed the paper to me. It was an order from the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, noting the courageous sacrifice of the Second Fleet, which provided the kamikaze planes with the opportunity to achieve the greatest combat results. What were these greatest combat results? The raid involved 114 aircraft, 60 fighters, 40 bombers, and 14 kamikazes. They lost 100 planes and damaged the aircraft carrier Hancock, the battleship Maryland, and the destroyer Bennett. The Second Fleet went out on its last campaign with a battleship, a light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. For 2 hours our ships were subjected to airstrikes involving a total of 386 American carrier-based aircraft. 10 of these planes were shot down by the anti-aircraft fire of our ships. 12 American pilots were killed. We survived only 3 destroyers. 2,498 Japanese sailors died on the Yamato, 446 on the Yahagi, and 721 on destroyers. These simple but startling statistics perfectly show who won and who lost the final battle between airplanes and surface ships. The mighty fleet that had waged war in the Pacific 40 months earlier by attacking Pearl Harbor was utterly destroyed. On April 7, 1945, with the sinking of the super battleship Yamato came the death of the Japanese Imperial Navy.